Hello class. Counting Stellar, there are 19 types in Pokemon. 8 of those types have other types that are immune to their moves. For example, ground attacks can't hit flying types. 3 types have no other types that are immune to their moves, but there are abilities that are immune to them. For example, no type is immune to water attacks, but abilities like Dry Skin, Storm Drain, and Water Absorb provide immunity. And lastly, there are 8 types that no other types or abilities can provide an immunity to. There's no way at all to be immune to them. Dark is one such type. This is partly why Knockoff is such a consistent move. In this video, I'll be explaining how important it is to have an immunity to every type in competitive Pokemon singles. I'll sort each type into one of 4 categories: immunity impossible, not important, moderately important, or very important. And as background footage to enjoy while I talk, I built a team with immunities to every type possible, both with natural typing and abilities. It's not amazing, but it was a lot of fun to use, and as always, the importable link is in the description for those who want to try it for themselves. Now, let's go over the easiest category first: immunity impossible. There is no way to be immune to bug, dark, fairy, flying, ice, rock, steel, or stellar attacks. Now, of course, there are some rare exceptions. You can be immune to a priority bug move like First Impression if Psychic Terrain is on the field, or if you have an ability like Armor Tail. And the ability Wind Rider grants immunity to a select few attacks from many types, like Hurricane, Blizzard, Fairy Wind, and more. Bulletproof protects from Gyro Ball and Pollen Puff, and despite Shedinja not being in Generation 9, the Wonder Guard ability can theoretically provide an immunity to any type. But generally speaking, there is no way to be immune to these 8 types, at least in any consistent or normal way. Now let's move on to the not important category. One type that sits firmly in this category is Grass. Grass isn't a very good offensive type. It's resisted by 7 types, many of which are very common. Most teams have several Grass resists, even without actively considering the type, and 4 times Grass resists are also quite common in many tiers. In Scarlet and Violet Overused, the main format for competitive singles, there are 5 4 times Grass resists. With a type this easy to resist, an immunity isn't that big of a deal. And it's a very good thing that a Grass immunity isn't important, because it's very difficult to be immune to Grass. The ability Sap Sipper is the only way to be immune to most Grass attacks. Very few Pokemon get this ability, and none of them are particularly strong in competitive play. Now, of course, the importance of immunities changes a bit depending on the tier you play. I'll be using Scarlet and Violet Overused, or SVOU for short, for my examples in this video, but this list will apply to a lot of singles formats. However, if you're playing a tier where a ton of top tiers are Grass types and Grass spam is a common archetype, a Grass immunity might be moderately important instead of not important. I doubt such a tier exists or has ever existed though. Grass types are just too easy to resist. I should also note that for doubles players, this list is probably not helpful. Immunities are important in VGC, but in a different way. Having only one Pokemon on each side of the field at once makes immunities noticeably stronger, as they can often be used to hard-wall Pokemon. It's also much less costly to switch in singles, allowing you to more frequently utilize immunities. Many of the principles I discuss will apply to all competitive Pokemon formats, but the importance categories I designated are based on singles. Moving on, the next type that's not important to have an immunity to is Psychic. Psychic is generally a pretty terrible type. It's quite poor both offensively and defensively, and has bad matchups into Ghost, Steel, and Dark, some of the best types in the game. Its main strength is unique moves like Future Sight, Stored Power, Psyshock, and Psychic Noise. Despite these strong moves, the vast majority of Psychic types are sitting in low tiers untouched. There are some really strong Psychic types, but generally the type isn't so powerful or common that it demands an immunity. Steel is inarguably the best defensive type in the game, it resists Psychic, and most tiers have high usage defensive Steel types that glue the tier together. The main reason Psychic is so low on this list is because Steel types are so great and so easy to fit onto teams. Now, despite a Psychic immunity not being very important, it is very easy to fit a Psychic immunity onto your team. The only way to be immune to most Psychic attacks is by having a Dark type, but Dark types are amazing and very common. It's also the only type that resists Ghost, so you'll often want to fit one onto your team anyway. If Tapu Lele returns, we'll have to give Psychic a lot more respect and bump it up to moderately important, but for now, it's not that big of a deal. If you don't have a dark type, you can also just put Terra Dark on one of your defensive Pokemon for the rare matchups where you do face a really strong Psychic type, like a Choice Specs Luster Purge Latios. Before I move on, I want to clarify again that this sorting is based on importance. I'll discuss how easy or hard it is to fit an immunity to a certain type onto your team, but that's not how I'm placing them into categories. A Psychic immunity, despite being very easy to fit onto teams due to how good Dark types are, is considered not very important because there aren't many powerful Psychic types and Steel can provide an easy resist. Now for the last type in the not very important immunity category, an immunity to the Poison type. This is a bit of an odd one. It's extremely important that your team has an immunity to the move Toxic, but you don't need a Poison immunity for this. A Poison type, Steel type, or a Pokemon with a status immune ability like Garganacl's Purifying Salt works just fine. As for a Pokemon that's immune to Poison type attacks though, this isn't that important. The majority of Poison types are primarily defensive Pokemon, and the type's offensive properties aren't amazing. A Ground or Poison type to resist Poison moves is usually enough. However, although a Poison immunity isn't that important itself, you'll almost certainly have one on your team. Being a Steel type is the only way to generally be immune to Poison moves, and Steel types are absolutely amazing. Steel types offer so many vital resistances like Dragon, Fairy, and Ice that team building without a Steel type is oftentimes impossible. So your team will probably have a Poison immunity whether you actively consider it or not. Before we move on to the moderately important section, I want to note that these previous types are not ranked in order. I'm not necessarily saying that a Psychic immunity is more or less important than a Poison immunity. All of these types aren't very important to have immunities to, but due to metagame changes and differences between tiers, I didn't want to get so specific as to rank them in order. Before we get to the moderately important immunities, if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing and or leaving a like. It helps out a lot. Now, the moderately important immunities. First, we'll go over Fire. There are only two ways to be immune to Fire moves. The main one is the ability Flash Fire, which grants an immunity, of course, and gives the Pokemon a Fire power boosting effect after being hit by a Fire move. There's also Well-Baked Body, the signature ability of Darkspun, but this is completely irrelevant competitively. Flash Fire distribution is much more generous, though. Some solid Pokemon like Heatran and Ceruledge get it. Still, it's not easy to fit a Fire immunity onto your team. Fire types have powerful moves like Overheat, Eruption, and Flare Blitz, and they do tend to be offensive Pokemon. On top of that, Sun teams are a popular option in many tiers, and Sun gives Fire type attacks a 1.5 times boost, allowing Fire types to often easily overpower resists. Flash Fire is extremely helpful against Sun teams, and generally nice for facing lots of Fire-type Pokemon. That being said, Water, a very common and fantastic defensive type, provides a resistance to Fire. Dragon types are also great for resisting Fire, and they often have high HP and defensive stats to help tank Fire hits. A Fire immunity isn't vital by any means, but it can be very nice in some matchups. A Water immunity is on the very similar level of importance as a Fire immunity. Water types are generally more defensively inclined, but they're much more common than Fire types. And, much like Fire types in Sun, Water types have Rain, that boosts water attacks by 1.5 times. Also, like Fire types, abilities are the only way to be immune to Water. Unlike Fire, though, there are quite a few Pokemon with Water immune abilities. Water Absorb, Dry Skin, and Storm Drain all provide an immunity to Water. In OU, Ogerpon, Wellspring, Volcanion, and Clodsire all have access to Water Absorb. Water immune abilities are great against Rain teams, Water types in general, and they're the only way to stop Water types from pivoting with Flip Turn, which can be super annoying for your opponent to deal with. Still, depending on the tier you play, it can be difficult to fit a Water immunity onto your team. It's in the same place as Fire. It's really nice to have in some matchups, but often a resist will do just fine. Water is resisted only by Dragon, Grass, and Water, but these are all pretty common and solid defensive types. The next type that's moderately important to have an immunity to is Ghost. Ghost isn't a common type, but it's arguably the best offensive type in the game. Normal types are immune to Ghost, and Dark types resist Ghost, but that's it. No other types can defensively deal with Ghost. Because of this, Ghost types often run choice items and spam powerful Ghost attacks like Poltergeist, Shadow Ball, and in the case of Choice Band Dragapult, Terra Blast Ghost. Having a normal type to shut this down is really nice. The problem is that normal types are really bad, usually. There are no normal types in OU. Some normal types are definitely viable in OU, but they're often quite niche. It's definitely not worth trying to fit a normal type onto your team if it doesn't fit well, just for the sake of a ghost immunity, but if your team does end up wanting a Chansey or a Mousehold, it's pretty useful to have around. Next up, we have the Dragon immunity, basically a fairy type. That's the only way to be immune to dragon attacks. Dragon types actually don't have a lot of great attacks. Outrage is powerful, but being locked in is awful, especially when fairy types exist and fairy is a common Terra type. Dragon Darts is a great move, but only Dragapult gets it. The real reason Dragon is moderately important instead of not very important is Draco Meteor. Every dragon type gets Draco Meteor, and it's a 130 base power special attack. It does lower special attack by 2 stages after being used, but often that one hit is enough to do serious damage, especially since it's commonly paired with choice specs. Considering how common dragon types are and how often they have great stats, including special attack, there's a good chance there's a fairly common Draco Meteor Pokemon in the tier you play. Having a fairy type to shut this down is very nice. And fairy types are generally very good, often considered the best type in the game, so it's usually not too hard to add a fairy type to your team. But the reason a dragon immunity isn't very important is that steel types resist dragon. As I said earlier, there are a ton of amazing defensive steel types, and they're almost mandatory when team building, so you'll probably have a strong dragon resist even if you don't have a complete immunity. Depending on how well your steel type can tank a Draco Meteor and how it matches up into common dragon types in the tier, it's often okay to forego having a fairy type. Now for the last 2 types in the moderately important section, fighting and normal. The only way to be immune to fighting moves and the only way to be immune to normal moves is having a ghost type, so I grouped these 2 immunities together. Fighting types are often strong, offensively inclined, and have powerful attacks like Close Combat, Superpower, and Focus Blast. Despite this, having a fighting immunity isn't very important at all. Flying, Poison, and Fairy are all great defensive types that resist fighting, and a resist is usually enough. In SVOU, Zamazenta's Iron Defense and Body Press combo is so strong that it can often muscle past resist, but there are ways to deal with this other than just ghost types. Ghost is also one of the best Terra types, so you can slap that onto your team in case you need an emergency fighting immunity. If fighting was the only type that Ghost was immune to, then the fighting immunity would be in the not very important section. The real reason for being in the moderately important section is that Ghosts provide an immunity to normal. Normal types are quite rare in almost every tier, and other than the very scantily distributed Boom Burst, there aren't any good, powerful normal type moves. The only reason that it's moderately important to have a normal immunity, or Ghost type, is Rapid Spin. Defog distribution was slashed in Scarlet and Violet, so Rapid Spin, a normal type move, is the most common way of removing hazards. If you're using a hazard stack team, having a ghost type is immediately moved up to the very important category. Even for teams that don't rely on hazard stack, it's nice to be able to block Rapid Spin. Even just keeping up Stealth Rock can be a complete game changer. Not every team needs a ghost type, but the immunities it provides are often very nice to have. Now for the very important immunities. The first is an immunity to ground. Most commonly, this comes in the form of flying types, but it can also be achieved through abilities like Levitate and the less common Earth Eater. A ground immunity is important for many reasons. First, only bug and grass resist ground. Second, ground types are extremely common. They're used as stealth rock setters, and they provide an immunity to electric, so ground types are highly used in almost every tier. In OU, the most used Pokemon is a ground type, Great Tusk. And third, perhaps the biggest reason of all, the move Earthquake is absolutely everywhere. This 100 base power, 100 accuracy, non-contact move is an amazing attack, and if you don't have an immunity, it's often extremely difficult to switch into. The distribution is also incredibly generous. Not only does almost every single ground type get Earthquake, but a ton of non-ground types also get it. And thanks to the high power and valuable super effective hits that ground type scores, most notably common defensive types Steel and Poison, it's used as coverage on non-ground types a lot. If your team is very well prepared for Earthquake, maybe you have a Rillaboom to half the power of Earthquake in grassy terrain, combined with a reliable physical wall like Alomomola, or if you have a great ground resist like a defensive Slitherwing, it can be okay to forgo a ground immunity, but most teams will want one. And now for the last type, and the absolute most important one to have an immunity to, Electric. The most common way to have an electric immunity is just having a ground type, but abilities like Volt Absorb, Lightning Rod, and Motor Drive also work, although these abilities aren't distributed generously. Electric is resisted by Grass, Dragon, and other electric types, and it's super effective against water and flying. A solid offensive profile, but nothing crazy. There also aren't that many great electric types. Like normal types, the vast majority of fully evolved electric types are rotting, unused in ZU, the lowest tier. The reason it's the most important type to have an immunity to is thanks to one move, Volt Switch. Pivoting is incredibly powerful in singles, and Volt Switch is not only the strongest pivoting move at 70 base power, it's also the only damaging pivoting move that doesn't make contact. People often complain about U-turn being too easy to click, and U-turn is weaker, makes contact, and Bug has a much worse offensive matchup spread than Electric. The only reason Volt Switch is balanced is because electric immunities exist. If you don't have an electric immunity on your team, Volt Switch will be extremely easy to click against you, dealing tons of damage and letting the user switch out and reposition themselves. With few exceptions, the only teams that can get away without an electric immunity are hyper-offense builds. In SVOU, even hyper-offense teams should typically have an electric immunity due to Raging Bolt Thunderclap, but in lower tiers it's much more acceptable to drop an electric immunity on hyper-offense. Fortunately, fitting an electric immunity often isn't very difficult. As I said earlier, ground types are extremely common and typically provide very valuable utility. In OU, there are 5 ground types, and 4 of them are considered top-tier Pokemon. So now you know how important it is to have every immunity when team building in competitive Pokemon singles. To briefly summarize, immunities to Bug, Dark, Fairy, Flying, Ice, Rock, Steel, and Stellar are impossible. Immunities to Grass, Psychic, and Poison don't hurt to have, but aren't that much of a help. A special note to Poison, though, is that Steel types are extremely good to the point where they're often considered mandatory, so you'll probably have a Poison immunity on your team, even if it isn't for that specific purpose. Next, immunities to Dragon, Fire, Water, Ghost, and Normal and Fighting are a pretty big help if you have them, but they're not required. And it should also be noted that if your team relies on entry hazards, having a normal immunity, so a Ghost type, is extremely important. And immunities to Ground and Electric are both very important. Almost all teams need both. Before I wrap up this video, I want to discuss Terra and its role when it comes to immunities. With Terra, you can change one of your Pokemon's types to become an immunity when it wasn't one before. Obviously, this won't work with Fire, Grass, and Water since you need an ability to be immune to those, but there are still 8 types that you can become immune to with Terra. Sometimes it's a good idea to use Terra to give your team another immunity, and other times it isn't. Suppose you have a team with no electric immunity. Making Galarian Slowking a ground type to deal with this is not really an acceptable fix. Volt Switch is a very common move, and if you Terra Ground, now your Slowking doesn't serve as a Fairy Resist or a Fighting Resist anymore. You also don't want to be forced to automatically Terastallize in a lot of matchups. Now, having a Terra Ground Slowking is better than having no electric immunity and nothing with Terra Ground, but the best option here is to rebuild. For an example where a Terra immunity does work, suppose you have a team with no ground immunities, but you have a core that's really good against Earthquake, like the Alomomola and Rillaboom core I mentioned earlier. You'll be fine against almost all ground types, but if you face an offensive Terra Ground Great Tusk with Headlong Rush, which isn't weakened by grassy terrain, that could be difficult. So you slap Terra Flying onto your Alomomola so you have a ground immunity for the few matchups where you really need it. That's a good idea. It's a bad idea to rely on using Terra Ghost to gain a spin blocker if you're using a hazard stack team, since this really limits the flexibility of your team. Once again, you'll be forced to Terastallize early in a lot of matchups. But if you have a team that doesn't heavily rely on hazards, but just has a Terra Ghost Pokemon for the few matchups where a spin blocker is really helpful, that's great. Basically, it's often a good idea to put immunity-granting Terra types onto Pokemon. Ghost, Fairy, and Flying are partly considered such great Terra types because of the immunities they provide. It's only problematic when you frequently rely on immunities granted by those Terra types to support your team. If you're constantly using Terra to gain an immunity that another Pokemon could have provided without Terra, it's probably a sign that you need to rebuild. Not only does this take Terra away from a Pokemon that might generally use it better, but it also puts you on the back foot instantly in many matchups, since you'll have to burn Terra, your strongest resource, just to not get immediately destroyed by your opponent. Lastly, remember that while this list generally applies to most formats in competitive singles, it is most accurate for SVOU, my personal area of expertise. If you're playing in a format where a lot of offensive poison types are top tiers, then a poison immunity may be moderately or even very important. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I'll do my best to respond to them all. And if you enjoyed the video and/or learned something, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Well, that's all. Class dismissed.